All right, well, welcome everyone. I'm Paul Spears. As Kyle mentioned, I've kind of been doing a lot of the Angular 2 investigation for us. And this summer, we actually had a couple projects where we're like, all right, let's take some existing apps that we've written and see what it would actually take to start converting these to Angular 2, see what that looks like, try and get a feel for what working with Angular 2 is going to be like. And at first, it was extremely daunting. Like, trying to get anything to work in Angular 2 was next to impossible, but they've made incredible bounds in the last few weeks of just every time you turn around, they got a new release that has 3 dozen more features than you even expected them to have, and the documentation is just charging right along behind it. So had I given this talk 3 weeks ago, it would have been nothing but misery and despair, but since then, things have actually gotten a lot better. So mentioning that though, this is me. In particular, Viktor Savkin, he's a member of the core Angular 2 team, and he's got a great blog here. That's his site for his blog, and on it he does a great job of bridging the gap between, okay, how do you write a component, how do you write a service, how do you bootstrap Angular, and then he goes and puts like the full picture into perspective of saying, all right, now that we've actually seen a little bit of syntax, like let's talk about how Angular 2 actually works. Like, how do you make an Angular 2 application? So if you're going to be looking for Angular 2 help online, this guy's pretty much the one and only source of good, up-to-date information that I've found, short of the charging forward of the documentation. Like in the last week, the documentation's actually been worth checking out and figuring out how they suggest you do it there. So I saw a question back there.
By the way, Brad Green, who's the head of the Angular team. I heard you say, Viktor's the smartest guy on our team. Please don't tell Viktor that, but Viktor's the smartest guy.
And with that kind of bleeds through in some of his blog posts. Like he writes blog posts like Angular 1's original documentation, and that is very dense. It's all very wordy. So it takes a few reads to get through it, but once you kind of internalize that, things really start to click together. So the basic idea for this talk, though, is that I'm trying to very quickly get through a bunch of the high-level concepts that really tie together what an Angular 2 app is, so we can actually dig into some real code today. So real quick, how do you get started? You can get it pre-built off Angular CDN, comes nice and packaged together. You just load it in with a module loader. If you can find a sandbox where everything's all put together. I happen to have one that I've made on GitHub, or you can clone it and build it yourself, or you can bundle it together manually with JSPM, which is essentially what I've done for you in the sandbox example. So Angular 3 is primarily built on 3 key pieces. It's their new component-driven approach to writing applications. They have a brand new data binding syntax, and they've got a brand new dependency injection system. And you can get a long way down the road knowing just these 3 pieces. So let's take a look at components. You guys have probably seen this tons of times. This is actually written in TypeScript. So if you get confused by some of the syntax, let me know. I'll just kind of hand wave over what it's doing mostly. But the idea is that we have a component, and this is going to be where our application starts. It says, all right, this is my app. What do I have inside of my app? And it just keeps composing out from there. Everything in Angular is a component, and in a more or less sense, so that everything that you write is something that can be injected. It's something that you wrap inside this kind of syntax of saying, hey, I have a chunk of code, and my top-level component is going to bring that code in. We'll see this syntax again later when we actually start working on the application itself, though. So here's kind of like that general idea mapped out. You have a top-level application component. You've got some filters in this like little task list example here. You've got a filters component, a talks component, and that's comprised of several other individual talks. So that's essentially how you want to think about writing your application. If you've got an Angular 1 application, this is step 1 for converting it, is making sure that you can rethink your original design in terms of this component hierarchy. So with data binding, trying to actually get data flow up and down your component hierarchy and out through your views, there are 2 primary ways to start that flow up and down. First, you can tell a component that it has properties, and it will then understand that, okay, I've got some data coming from my parent component. You can also say that a component has some events, And that's a way of saying, okay, I plan on emitting some information back up to my parent component. And we'll see exactly how to bind these in the HTML here right now. So here we have our component. This is a child component. So we saw the app level component, and this is just one child of it. And here we're specifying that it has some properties, and we're saying that that property name is provided by parent. We then follow that up by actually specifying inside our controller, or inside our component, inside our constructor, that, hey, here's provided by parent, and then we can manipulate it however we want. Then finally, you can bind to it directly on the template associated with that component. So now, this is always going to display whatever provided by parent was set to on the parent controller. Parent component. A lot of what starts to happen here is you start to realize that, components are essentially like directives. And in fact, if you ask, the Angular 2 team, well, what happened to directives? They'll tell you that a component plus a template is a directive in Angular 2. So here we've specified that this component has a template, so it would be considered a directive. With properties and events, you realize that, these are directives with isolate scope that have been using one-way binding and event hooks. So if you think about components, directives with isolate scope, with one-way binding and event hooks, and you're going to be in good shape. You've got a large step forward in how Angular 2 works in comparison to Angular 1. So the other half of the story is events. Just like with the properties, you had to specify it on your component. Likewise, we're saying this has some events. You name your event emitter. And then down here, you just say that it is an event emitter. And then this is actually the parent template right here. The parent template says, okay, whenever the child data emitter emits something, call the callback function on me. So that's how you get information back to the parent. It says, okay, this directive here is going to have something that's going to emit data. I want you to listen for those events and call my function that I have. So dependency injection. That's the third key thing. It's completely different. Just throw out everything you knew about dependency injection in Angular 1. It does not apply. But with dependency injection, you kind of start wrapping your head around it. Think of it also as a tree. If you inject something at the top, it becomes automatically available to anyone who wants it further on down the hierarchy of your components. If you inject something down here, so if I inject utils into talks, then that becomes available to talks and its subcomponents. Likewise, I inject the backend service up at the top, and that becomes available everywhere in my application. But they have this ability to actually, in Angular 1, everything you injected was a singleton. Well, in Angular 2, you can actually say, I want to inject a new version of my backend service down here. Let's say we manipulated that backend service somehow that isn't compatible down here. Well, inject a new copy, and then you have it available to you. And again, any child component of that. So there's a lot more to the story than that. But again, this is kind of like your first steps. You can really start writing some big apps just with this piece alone, this bit of knowledge alone. All right, so this is kind of putting together a few of those pieces that we just looked at. And let's say I've got a component. This is my app component. And I'm saying that I've got some bindings to my thing. My thing can be just about anything. They've made it so that the injector can inject services. It can inject other components. It can inject DOM node elements. It can inject just about anything. And so if we have something that we want to inject, this is how we do it. We use the bindings keyword here inside of the component. And then down in your constructor, you have to say that not only do I want to be able to bind to my thing, that right here I'm saying I actually need a hold of it. Like, give me a hold of it right here, and then you can give it a local variable name, and then you can access it. And then down in the child, right here, we didn't specify bindings because that would then say I want a new copy. I want you to create a new version. Instead, I just request it right here in my constructor, and it knows to climb that hierarchy looking for someone who had requested that injection earlier. Yeah?
So if you did specify bindings in the child, does it override all the bindings?
It would.
Or does it just, you can like add new or replace?
It overrides them from this point down in the component hierarchy.
Right, but it overrides all the bindings, not just a specific one?
No, just the ones that just the ones you request for.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Can you go over that directives, red below template there?
Sure. And we'll see this a lot more, but I need directives here saying that I have this child component directive so that Angular actually, this is Angular trying to play nice with things like web components because you have just about anything in your HTML. So this is how you indicate what's actually an Angular directive versus some other random non-standard HTML thing. And so here is saying, expect there to be something called child component inside my template. And right here, we actually see I've got child component right here inside the parent template. This says expect it to be there so it knows to actually sync it up with the directive we declared below. Yeah.
In Angular 1, the injection kind of worked by name, essentially. Like, how does it know, like if you list a bunch, how do those get associated to the right thing in the constructor call?
A bunch of bindings, so back up at the top.
By type or something? Like,
Right here.
like that one you just have one and then you have one, right? But like,
Right. Well, this right here is actually just a string, so that survives any kind of annotation like we saw before. And it does it actually down here when we request my thing. This is actually where it understands what to go look for. This is actually a reference to a class called my thing. Up here, this is just a way of saying that, yes, this guy's actually wanting a new copy of my thing.
yeah, but I'm trying to understand, like let's see, like right there you list one. So it's kind of
Right.
obvious that the one you list is the one you describe in the
Right.
constructor.
That also accepts an array.
Like, so like, is it positional is what I'm asking? Like, is it an array where it has to be in the same order?
No, that array is in its order has absolutely nothing to do with how it's going to inject. It's just saying that if you've requested a injectable here,
So it's
then expect to inject a new one.
By the class or type that's somehow using.
The type right here, this is an actual reference to the class.
That's wired in pretty deep to TypeScript then to understand that type.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And what you're talking about with like, ordering and you have to do name lookup kind of stuff, when you drop down to doing this in ES5, like you see that very prevalent that, oh, hey, there's actually some sort of matching here in ES5 that has to take place because you actually have one more step that you need to do to make that connection between here and up top. Okay, so I just wanted to get through that real quick so we can actually do some live code. So that's what we're going to do now. And everything we saw, we are going to see again, time provided. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up. I got a little bit of boilerplate already in place. I've already got Angular here. It's already loaded up and ready to go. And if we come over here, we can see what I've got so far. Just a simple hello world. Too small. Good point. That's too big. All right, so this is what I'm aiming for. It's just a simple little to-do app. Along the top, it tells you how many tasks you currently have that aren't finished. Along the left, you've got a list of tasks. When you click on one, you actually see the details of that task on the right. And then you can mark it complete to see that change here, as well as see that count reduce from having clicked on it. So that's the goal. We'll see how far we get. All right, so to start, let's go ahead and take a look at app.ts. So this is really the starting point of our application. And we can see that because I've imported it using JSPM system.js. We'll hand wave over that kind of stuff for now, but just know that this is where I've declared to go look for some code. And then down here at the bottom, I've told Angular to actually bootstrap itself using my app component as the actual application level component. So you actually make that declared explicitly right here. A little bit bigger, okay?
Back row.
Yeah. So here, yeah. So here, we're actually saying, bring in stuff from Angular 2. So this is just a module system. It uses technically the TypeScript, module system, but that's pretty much exactly the same as the ES6 module loader. And here we're saying go ahead and bring in all this stuff from Angular 2. And down here, we're specifying that, hey, I've got a component, and you'll actually see that I'm requesting this component when you see my-app inside of a template. And now here, we're saying here's a template associated with this component whenever you run across it. So this is kind of our starting point. So this is where we're going to have to bring in the data. So to do that, I'm just going to inline right here, create a data service. So to do that, I'm going to say @injectable, and this just creates a generic thing that can be injected. And that actually doesn't have any properties. After that, we just say class data service. So I'm just making a generic JavaScript class here, and I want to set up my constructor, and my constructor is going to have a function called this.getData, and that's going to be a function that has no parameters, and this is just arrow syntax from ES6. So this is just a fancy shorthand way of saying it is a function, and I'm going to return an array of objects with a task and it has a status, and then finally an isDone property that's Boolean. So we're just going to start right there with the simplest one we can for now. Yeah?
Why would you add a method in the constructor versus writing it as a method of the data service class?
A habit. Really, that's just what it is. It's habit for me to have done it that way, coming from Angular first and then into the JavaScript world. Like, this is how I wrote all of my services and other constructor functions in Angular. And so it's just kind of a bad habit. So yes, I could have just said, get data, or function get data, like that. But
You
yeah.
can see that if you had a pre-existing service from an Angular 1 application, you could just take that function and stick it right
Exactly. Yeah, so you could copy the contents from .service and drop them right here. All right, so now we have a simple data service that we can call getDataOn. And let's move back now to the app component. So here inside our constructor, we're going to need to bring him in. So the first thing we need to do is say, hey, I've got bindings set up that we need. That's going to request data service. And actually, that's not a string. That was a typo earlier. This is just, hey, go grab data service. And now here, I can say that I want to use the instance that we just created right up here. All right, so we've got our data service, but we need to be able to count inside our parent app, our parent module. We need to count up how many tasks are in there. So we're going to need something like a task count to bind to. Just saying that that is a number. So inside here, I can set that. This task count equals my service dot get data, and that returns the data dot length. So now we have a way of actually showing that count. So let's start from there, and now we can go back over to our template and bind to this. So just that familiar one that we're already seeing, and we're going to say I want to bind to task count. So let's see where we are now. Well, we're off to a great start. Okay. So it's complaining that injectable is not defined because you're going to need that up here. There we go. So now now we're starting to see some progress. So now we need to start thinking about the child components now. So let's go ahead and work on one of those. So we're going to bring in now the task list. So to do that, we're going to say at component, and we're going to give it a selector. And this is how we identify what this is anytime you come across it in the HTML. And this one's going to need some properties because he's actually going to get his list from the parent. So to do that, we say, hey, I've got some properties, and we're going to name that property tasks. And it's also going to have some events because whenever we select one, we want it to update over on the detail pane. So we're going to have an event called select. And this one actually has a view associated with it since it's going to display our list. We're going to have to set up a template URL. And we're going to place this guy in app/tasklist.html. And since we're going to be repeating over those tasks, we're going to need access to ng4. It's the looping over the various data models. So to do that, we actually need to declare the fact that, hey, this guy's got an ng4 directive on him in some place.
We need to include that.
And that's exactly where we're headed next. To use that, we need to say, hey, ng4 is something else that we need to bring in. Now this model of like, oh, bringing in all of these things, this isn't actually that bad. There's a lot of things that you can import that bulk a lot of the commonly used things together. But this is just the individual import that we would want. All right, so now we can.
If Paul,
Yeah.
a question about that.
Sure.
So does that mean that one way or another, using some of the shortcuts you just talked about, you could potentially have a list of every directive you use at the top of everything that possibly uses it?
Mm-hmm.
So you can't just like if you stick a directive, if you start using another directive down deep inside, you may have to walk back up the code and find a point to mention it.
Yeah, yeah. Ideally, though, I think what I've seen is that they're working on having it so you just have a common directives as something that you import at the top, and then you're done. Then anywhere else, you do still have to specify which directives are on that specific template, but you don't have to keep re-importing them every time.
Yeah, Kyle, I don't know exactly what form it's going to take, but in another one of those conversations with Brad, we talked about the fact that they're what they call the sugaring phase of the API, where they've got the API, like its capabilities fairly nailed down, but now they want to make it so that it doesn't, it's painful to use it. And this is one of the pain points they talked about. It's like, we don't want you to have a giant list of directives you carry with you everywhere. So they're figuring out how that works in practice to make it easy and frictionless to do stuff.
Yeah, and that's what I was kind of alluding to earlier. I was saying how they're making these rapid changes every 3 weeks to where all of a sudden, like everything that you thought you knew, like it just kind of starts to go away and melt away, and you don't have to jump through as many hoops. All right, so to finish up this task list component, we need to actually specify that not only do we have this property called tasks, but we need to say that he's actually part of this task list. And he is an array of and we need to specify that select is also a part of this class, and he is an event emitter. That's something that we also need to bring in here. And we'll see what that means and how to use it here in a moment. So now we can actually make our constructor. And we're going to set this dot click task. So we haven't seen this before. This is something that I'm actually creating right here. Like Mark mentioned before, I don't have to necessarily make it inside the constructor. That's just kind of where I end up putting them a lot of times when I'm messing around like this. So this dot click task, it's going to be a function that accepts a individual task from that list and performs the following. It's going to say this dot select, so the event emitter up here, dot next. And that's how we're going to emit an event. And now anyone listening for this select event is now going to be notified with whatever I've placed right here. So I'm going to send in the task property of the task I clicked on. So again, we have this task guy here. I've sent in an individual task right here, and I'm sending in his individual property. And so whoever's listening for this event will receive that data. So now we need to work on the HTML for it. So let's.
27, should that just be the event emitter definition? Or did you mean you need to do it up like that?
Yeah, I'm meant to hit new. I don't know why. I'm still learning quite a bit, but everything I've seen says you actually want to new it right here. All right, so let's go ahead and dig into task list.html now. Okay, so for this, pretty straightforward. We're going to have I'm going to go give it a quick label. And we're going to have a UL. Inside that, we're going to have some list items. And here I'm saying that whenever you click on this list item, execute the following function. Click task T. And we'll see where that T comes from here in a second. And now we're going to use that ng4. Star ng4 equals, I'm just going to type this out and then talk over here in a second what I'm doing. Yeah, lovely, isn't it? And then finally we come in here and we bind to t.task. So some of this I'm still trying to figure out exactly, but long story short, before with Angular 1, things like these were attribute level directives that you've placed inside of an element. But really what's going on here is that this is sugar for actually having placed nested one element with inside another, and it will actually desugar it to that. So it actually creates an additional element inside the shadow DOM where it actually ends up saying this is actually an ng4 where I want to show this content. And then these are needed in order to help track where that stuff is coming from as it passes it down. A lot more stuff is needed, and this is as best as they've sugared it to right now. But this is separate from the ng4. This is just saying that when you click on something, go ahead and call that function that I specified earlier right here. So when they click, that's what's going to fire off the event, and the task that I passed into it was right here. I'm grabbing T from my local variable T that I've declared coming off of each one of the task items. So with me for the most part, even though the syntax is kind of weird. All right.
Need the hash I equals index?
Yeah, that's the part that I really don't know.
Using it, do you need it?
Yep. It explicitly says that this will not work. That it needs this to help track where data is coming from, in what order.
That is weird.
Yeah.
Is that some of that polish? Yeah, actually, the star on the ng4, there was like a murmur that went through the crowd when I saw one of the presentations of this. And the presenter's like, the star may go away. Don't freak out about the star.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the thing a lot of people know is it used to be a bang. Everybody's like, not in G4? Why are you not? And that's when they changed it to a star. The ng4 is under like heavy debate inside the Angular team because just like in this presentation right here, you're already seeing people go, there's the same thing happening inside of Google.
But the most frightening thing that this is actually a 3-step sugared version of this. So, all right, so that's our task list. But now we need to plug it into our main directive here. All right, so let's head back to, let's see, the app template. Now here we now need to actually plug in that child directive. So now we're going to say the list, and then we're going to bind in tasks. And that has to come from somewhere on the parent component. So we haven't actually provided anything for that, so we got to fill that in later. And then we want to say whenever the select event inside the list is fired, I want you to call my select task function and pass in whatever that event was that fired. So if we go back to app TS, here is my constructor. So we're now going to need that select task as well as the task list itself. So we're just going to go ahead and this dot tasks equals, we're going to go ahead and just assign it right here and then reference it down here. Then we need one more piece, and that is the this dot select task. So it's a function, it accepts a task name, and I'm going to cheat and use Lodash to do a lot of the work. So it's going to set something that I haven't declared yet called the selected task equal to underscore dot find this dot task list. Oh, sorry, I call them task here, tasks. And I want it to find where the task property is equal to the task name I've passed in. So let's go ahead and add a couple more types here. So selected task is an object, and tasks is an array of objects. Okay, so that's the three things I've got so far, and then select task is a function, but I'm not going to bother with that one right now. All right, so now we're starting to see a little bit more of the picture. Let's see what we got left. I know we need to set the tasks over on our template. So this is the guy that's actually on the parent component. This is the guy that's actually inside the child. So we're kind of passing this data straight on through. So we save it and go look at it now. Let's see what I've broke. Typo on line 34.
Do that route like that.
Yeah, he always complains. That's WebStorm really doesn't know what to do with that. Like we're like three things weird to playing JavaScript right there at that point. So it was actually complaining about unexpected token right paren on 34. Well, when all else fails, I'm about to copy and paste my working example just to move along.
We can't really tell the difference between a curly brace and a parenthesis from back here.
Yeah, I'm right up on it and I can barely tell also. Like what's strange is that there is no right paren on line 34.
If you click on it, does it show you the example?
Yeah.
Okay, so is that right?
All right, so let's go ahead.
On line 24, is there two curlies there?
There's a curly and then a paren.
Do you need to import underscore to use it?
I've already got it in my, I just put that in globally. All right, there. That's Lodash actually, but yeah. All right, well, I'm going to cheat real quick and copy my working example here.
It's about 80% space there.
Seems a lot like getting almost commented.
And then I got to hack a couple things in real quick. So this dot task list equals my service dot get data. Okay. So that means I just need to update one more thing over here, and that was that this is now called task list. Now what does it have to say about it? I'm sure there's something. well, that's special. Same exact error on line 34. So he's actually complaining about something above that.
Yeah. Has to be something about that.
I was complaining about something in my task list. NG4, comma, select. Well, let's go ahead and grab him too then.
It is surprising about line 27 that that's valid syntax. I would have thought you'd have to say select is an event emitter, and then down in your constructor, set it to new event emitter.
Yeah, that's TypeScript accepts that. Oh, well, I'm going to cheat again and copy this working example. It's much happier about something.
Oh, you did a
You did
select
go
equals
relative.
instead of
You're
a,
exporting it.
before you had select colon.
There you go.
Select equal to your event emitter, not select colon.
Yeah.
Now it's complaining about task detail because I haven't put him in yet.
Why don't you just undo back to where you were?
My all right, so here I've got to update my template task-list.html. All right, I think we're closing in on it now. There you go.
Yeah, look at that. The count isn't filled out.
So I broke the count.
The count is blank.
That's because I didn't actually set them here. Get rid of some of my leftover boilerplate, move him to the right spot. That's right. So as you can tell, working with Angular 2 is just an absolute breeze right now. All right, so we got that going. I'm going to do one more quick thing, kind of running out of time. I'm just going to drop this guy in just so you can see the whole story. But we've got the list, now we need the details. So I'm going to drop him in right here. He's got a property, which is a task, an event, which when I check complete task, propagate back up to the parent. And beyond that, this isn't anything you haven't already seen before. This is unnecessary in this example. And then likewise, we need a template for them. And to do that, we need to make a new file. I'm just going to drop this right in, and this is basically binding to that task that we passed in from the parent and looking at his properties. And we got to click on the button that says, hey, whenever you click this, call the finish function on this component. And then we need to plug in our task detail on the main app. One final step is to actually refer to it right here. And to do that, we were called the directive, get rid of some CSS boilerplate, say, hey, the task is actually going to be my selected task. Whenever the complete task event is called, call my mark completed event, and things propagate back down the other direction. So now let's see if we got it all running. Close, but no cigar. Oh, yep, sure it is. I've skipped a little bit of proper initialization, but if we refresh it, I click the task, we see the details, I can mark it complete, count goes down. So, yeah, a lot of work just to have 3 little pieces of data change. A lot of work. So short of throwing that all in the same component, that was, to the best of my knowledge, the most minimal way to actually achieve that. So, any questions? I'm sure there are plenty.
I have a question.
Yeah.
For somebody else though. So I know that you told me the answer, but probably nobody else. So how recently were the alphas good enough that you could get through this with the moderate level of you know, kind of hoops you had to jump through?
Alpha 34.
And like, I don't.
That's
track with the numbers.
that's like 6 weeks old.
Okay.
Beyond that, like you just lose so much sugar, and the documentation is even more thin than it is now. Blog posts aren't relevant, and it just kind of starts to fall off.
So do you feel like as of August 2015 is a good time to start working with this stuff?
That totally depends on if you think you're going to like it, because it is not Angular 2. It is a new thing. It only resembles Angular 2 in that there are some, you know, you're like, hey, I kind of remember that guy from Angular 1. It's not so much like, okay, so this is just like Angular 1. Nothing feels like that, at least not yet. The sugaring may help drive it there more and more, but even architecturally, it's baked in that you have to do your apps completely different in how you structure them. Like I've put together a list of things that you should do to help, you know, prepare your app today in Angular 1 for making that jump to Angular 2. And like, that's a long list of things to go and change inside an Angular 1 app across the board, especially if you didn't start off doing that. I think the most important thing that I've seen right now, though, is points 1 and 2. You know, if you don't use ng controller and you compose your application of isolate scope directives, you're going to stand a far greater chance of actually making the jump to Angular 2 than you would otherwise.
I've been telling my students the right thing.
Yeah.
So you get down to that second to last one about services and factories, then I'm going to have to go back and I'm going to have to send some apology videos for that one.
Yeah, Mark.
I wonder if it's really worthwhile to go through all of these steps. I mean, suppose you've got a really large Angular 1 app. You're going to have to change so much. Maybe you're better off to just plan on when you're ready, you're going to rewrite your app.
That's what we're doing.
Yeah, and that's what everyone's asking, and no one's really responding to it. It's just like, you know, well, you know, if you're really that worried about it, then don't make an Angular app, or just be happy with the support that's going to be around for Angular 1 for however many years that is now. And yeah, that's a good question that you just have to ask, because when you write your Angular 1 app like this, you're cutting a lot of the legs out of the feature set of Angular 1.
And in my experience, writing the REST services that are behind your app takes a little more time than the UI anyway. So at least you still keep your existing REST services.
Yeah.
Of those things, how many of them are things that you would have already considered good practices from the umpteen Angular apps you've worked on if you weren't preparing for Angular 2?
Well, using services and not factories, there's other benefits for that that I always recommend, just because it's easy to port code into and out of, and easier to port code into and out of an Angular app if you use that pattern. And then scope.watch, we always recommend avoiding it like the plague. The only time that we've been like, yeah, this is kind of a common use for it, is if you need to observe what's going on in an injected service inside of a controller. And that's about the only place that we've done that, and not been like, shame on you for it. But now, like, that entire construct is going away. And then if you can write your services to use some sort of observable library and to return some sort of observable object, then you can like be one step ahead because that's how you're going to do it in Angular, is you're going to actually observe service properties instead. And so if you can do that, then you're also one step ahead, because you've eliminated your last need for a scope watch. And then directives, we strongly recommend using directives whenever possible, but like this pushes it to the extreme. Angular 2 really goes off the deep end there, in terms of everything has to be in a directive. So it's mostly good practices from Angular 1 in short, but this kind of like drags it to where it doesn't make sense in Angular 1 to go this far. Yeah.
So
So with the double binding going away, that's just double binding between services and controllers effectively, or components and services and such, right? So you're going to be communicating those via events. Does that mean when I modify an event, every time I need to stop thinking of it in terms of I have an object that we both are watching, and instead of I am taking some action and they know what that action is at the top? And then also, how does that affect to the DOM itself, like to the display? If I change that object, does the display update? There's one double binding.
Yeah, so,
there, right?
so two-way binding is completely gone. Does not exist in Angular 2.
Sure.
And how it happens is the properties, those bind one direction and that's down. So data flows down. That's the only way to get data to flow through Angular 2 application is down that component hierarchy. It is the execution of an event, an event emission that actually has a way to hook into functionality that exists higher up. And so what's going to happen is you get this two-pass kind of process that goes on where it will propagate any changes down the property chain in the components, and those may or may not result in additional updates being called, or along the way rather, updates may have been called, and as it goes back, it will go back up that chain as needed, and it's got this complex observable pattern that I don't have enough of my head wrapped around to understand like where to truncate that process, and understands that it doesn't need to go any further in various areas up or down. But yeah, the two-way data binding is gone. You can only go down or call functions up.
The very bottom is the actual display, like the view, right?
The very bottom is the view.
So things only go down, right? If I modify it, it shows up in the HTML, right?
So you can have chunks of that view actually all the way through. So in this example, I just had that really tiny template that had nothing but these guys in it. But yeah, there could be like hundreds of lines of HTML that has nothing to do with components inside here, and likewise for every component beneath it. So like the view is like interspersed through all the components.
Sorry, I'm just trying to establish what up and down were.
Right, up. So if we go back to this guy here.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so down means that, if a property change, or if a value changes here, it knows that this has a property registered on it, so it has to change it here, and likewise, I'll keep propagating down. And it actually updates all that in memory before redrawing the DOM. So that's, okay, out of time already.
Well, I just want to make a quick comment. Sorry, Mark. To keep people from being totally scared by the fact that two-way data binding is gone, gone, gone. It is gone, but there is a shortcut syntax that is being provided that combines a property with an event that looks a lot like two-way data binding. So don't think that you're going to have to like double the size of your templates just to get data flow moving what is effectively two ways. You still have one-way data binding, as in the data flow only goes one direction, but you can couple that with an event so that in practice it looks a lot like what two-way data binding.
And then they've also got a whole set of form controls that like automatically do that. Like even that sugar is then added on top of with things that they expect you to need two-way binding for. And they emulate that look and feel from Angular 1 and the forms components. Right.
Back in your JavaScript code where you were adding a method to the object inside the constructor, I just want to point out that that's not exactly the same as putting it as a method in the class, because the way it is set up there, every object you create is going to get a new function object.
Right.
Whereas if it was outside, it would be on the prototype.
Right.
And you'd be sharing it.
Yeah, you're using more memory.
Yep, I know.
We're gonna run out of memory.
Yeah. But all right, guys, that's all I got. Thanks.